An evil empire is sucking the life force.
1997 was a landmark year for Final Fantasy. As well as marking the franchise's 10th anniversary, 1997 of course saw the release of Final Fantasy VII, which proved to be Square's biggest ever hit at the time, and finally put the company on the map within the mainstream gaming market. What had previously been a well-respected but nonetheless niche development studio was now well and truly a household name. Mind you, this wasn't without its costs. With FF7's status as a PlayStation exclusive, Square had effectively cut ties with longtime partner Nintendo, a separation that would last for the better part of a decade, which no doubt also sowed some seeds of resentment and betrayal among the Nintendo loyalists in the audience. Nonetheless, with FF7 quickly skyrocketing into becoming one of the PlayStation's biggest hits, it seems like the number 7 truly was a lucky one for Final Fantasy. In light of this, it didn't take long for Square to start transferring some of their back catalog to their new benefactor's console. Around 2 months after the release of Final Fantasy VII, a PlayStation port of Final Fantasy IV would be released in Japan. While this version is bookended by new FF7-style FMVs, the game itself is almost completely unchanged from its Super Famicom form. It is an incredibly faithful port, with the only notable quality of life change being that there's now a run button, a feature originally introduced in FF5. Other than that though, everything is the same. Sprites and backgrounds haven't been changed whatsoever, inventory size is still limited, there are almost no in-game help menus or item descriptions, you still have to manually switch between characters in the menus, so on and so forth. The PlayStation port of FF4 was handled by Japanese game developer Tosei, a company known for doing faithful video game ports, with a policy of only making changes that are expressly requested by the original developers. But of course, bringing a cartridge-based game to a CD-ROM inevitably results in different performance, the most prominent of which being load times. Moving from room to room is met with a second or two of pause, and battles are slower to transition in and out of, but most egregious of the added loading occurs whenever the player wants to save or load their game. A process that originally took seconds on a cartridge can now take around a full minute. Their way of mitigating this inconvenience was with the addition of what they call a memo save option, which instead of saving a permanent file to a memory card, will create a temporary save file directly on the console's internal RAM that can be saved and loaded in a matter of seconds. The PlayStation's RAM is reset whenever the console is turned off, meaning these files disappear as soon as the power is cut, but this memo save feature is a great way to quickly create a backup file that can be instantly loaded from a game over or a soft reset, reserving the slow process of permanent saves for only when you plan to stop playing. It's not a perfect solution, but it's an appreciated one nonetheless. Let's just hope you don't have any unexpected power surges. While I'm at it though, can someone please explain to me how in the hell this game takes up 2 blocks on the memory card? The original Super Famicom game is barely over half a megabyte in total, and this version features no new content whatsoever, not even any bonus gallery modes. How does a single save file manage to take up more than 8 kilobytes? The PS1 ports of FF5, 6, and Chrono Trigger don't even require 2 blocks, unless you also save the gallery data, so was this just a case of bad optimization? While this port was a standalone release in Japan, North America would see Final Fantasy IV included in a double pack alongside the PS1 port of Chrono Trigger as part of Final Fantasy Chronicles, released in 2001 as part of the pre-release hype leading up to Final Fantasy X. And this version actually sees some slight improvements over the Japanese release. While it still takes nearly a minute to save or load your game, the in-game load times have been improved, to the point where I barely even notice a difference between this and the cartridge version. They also applied a bit of a fix to the muffled soundtrack by simply having the gameplay wave files of the original tracks off the CD itself, instead of the recreated synthesizers running off the PS1 sound chip. This, of course, means the tracks take a second or two to start up, they can't loop, and are forced to start from the beginning whenever they're interrupted, but in this game's case that actually doesn't matter all that much, since the gameplay in FF4 tends to be paced fast enough for the music to change before it loops anyway. The sound effects unfortunately still use the same downsized sampling, so there's no improvement there. Unlike the other PS1 ports of 16-bit Square titles, this version of Final Fantasy IV features no bonus galleries or omake modes. Anybody remember that word? Omake? Why were we ever using that word? I looked it up. It's not like it's some vague, untranslatable term that can only be understood in Japanese. It literally just means bonus. Why were we not just saying bonus? Why were we all such frickin' weebs back then? Anyway, this version of FF4 is just the base game as it was on Super Famicom with no attached bells or whistles. But honestly, for me, that might actually be its biggest selling point. At least, it is for a non-Japanese audience. See, for those outside of Japan, the PS1 release of Final Fantasy IV is the one that's most faithful to the original uncensored Super Famicom version. The American SNES version, released here as Final Fantasy II, saw significant changes during localization, including several items, spells, and battle commands being completely removed, and the overall difficulty being drastically reduced. The PS1 release, though, in addition to being the first one to retain the game's original numbering in the West, is also completely unaltered and uncensored. Rose's Prey ability, Cecil's Darkness ability, the Protect and Shell spells, etc. are all restored in this version, and the game also received a new localized script that may not be perfect, but it certainly is an improvement over the messy and at times indecipherable SNES dialogue. Don't worry though, they kept the spoony bard. In terms of presentation and content, this is the version of FF4 that's closest to the original 1991 game, using the original battle backgrounds and character portraits that were later replaced in the WonderSwan and GBA ports. Basically, short of fan translations and emulation, this PS1 release of FF4 is the closest Americans ever got to a straight, unaltered release of the original Super Famicom game. And if you ask me, that will always give this version a certain unique value. The post-FF7 wave of PlayStation Final Fantasy releases wouldn't just consist of ports of past titles, though. In June of 1997, the franchise would see a new spin-off title that would expand Final Fantasy into a new subgenre, a tactical RPG. The idea for Final Fantasy Tactics goes as far back as 1993, when Hironobu Sakaguchi drafted up a short design document outlining the basic idea of a tactical Final Fantasy game. While the title, Final Fantasy Tactics, was trademarked right away, Sakaguchi remained too busy working on the mainline titles to actually spend any time working on this new idea. That is, until late 1995, when three members of Quest Corporation, a dev studio perhaps best known for the Ogre battle games, left the company to join Square. Yasumi Matsuno, Akihiko Yoshida, and Hiroshi Minagawa were fresh off the creation of Tactics Ogre, and upon learning that Square was interested in creating a tactical spin-off for Final Fantasy, the three would be assigned as heads of the production, with Matsuno as writer and director, and Minagawa and Yoshida as art director and character designer respectively. Matsuno originally wished to design much of the gameplay himself, but seeing as the dev team was fairly small, he was relegated to mainly writing the story, while Final Fantasy regular Hiroyuki Ito would take over game design duties. Ito would set out to make a more exciting take on the typical TRPG formula. Where many TRPGs have the player commanding large groups of troops en masse in a sort of war simulation, Ito envisioned something more akin to the traditional Final Fantasy format, where you fight through several small-scale battles with a group of characters that you gradually develop and improve over time. The graphics and music in this game both deserve special mention. First of all, the game overall benefits from great art direction and character design, but moreover, the character sprites, despite being presented in a somewhat old-fashioned chibi art style, feature an obsessive amount of detail and an impressive range of movement and emotion. Characters are given several unique animations to serve the purposes of each individual scene, some of which you may only see once or twice. Characters will kneel, they'll jump, they'll clutch their chests, they'll cough up blood, they'll hold hands, they'll hang their heads, and they'll express an incredible variety of emotion and movement, from the subtle to the overt, from the major to the minuscule. And this all displays an astonishing amount of thought and effort when you remember that 2D sprite art has to be hand-drawn and animated frame by frame, as opposed to 3D models being manipulated via a simulator or motion capture. Despite 2D sprites being largely considered outdated in 1997, Final Fantasy Tactics has visually aged much more gracefully than the more advanced PS1 games from around the same time. The music, composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto and Masaharu Iwata, is also pretty brilliant. When compared to Uematsu, whose style is very clearly inspired by progressive rock of the 60s and 70s with a flair for the bombastic, Tactics composers aimed for more classical orchestra, with a dynamic and high-energy feel and heavy focus on leitmotif. The hero's theme is easily one of my favorite musical motifs in the entire Final Fantasy franchise. While it may be a bit disappointing to longtime fans that the game doesn't use any classic recurring Final Fantasy pieces, they at least snuck the classic prelude into the victory music. And after I ragged so hard about FF7's sound font, I'm glad to say that Tactics sound font is the complete opposite to me. It sounds incredible. It almost sounds like it's pre-recorded orchestra, but it isn't. It's all synthesized. I double-checked this to be sure, but it still sounds really goddamn good. I don't know what specific sound font they used, but you could almost mistake these for live recordings if you didn't know any better. Hats off to the composers and sound programmers on this one, they did a fantastic job. One goal the game designers had with Final Fantasy Tactics was to make a strategy game that was more accessible to a casual RPG player, one where most players could get to the end of the story without having to completely master every facet of the gameplay. And when compared to other tactical games of the era, Final Fantasy Tactics does feel somewhat more streamlined. Where Tactics Ogre granted the player a party of up to 10 characters to command, Final Fantasy Tactics settles on just 5. Battles play out on fairly small arenas that max out at a 16x16 grid. Stages are essentially dioramas rendered in full 3D, and thus the camera can be tilted, zoomed, and rotated as the player feels the need. And keeping battlegrounds at this relatively small size was largely done to keep battles running at a smooth 60 FPS. Backgrounds can feature tiered landscapes such as waterfalls, cliffs, and bridges, and certain tiles may hold hidden items or traps. Where Final Fantasy Tactics really stands out when compared to other tactical games is that it adopts the mix-and-match capabilities of the franchise's job system. Every playable human party member in Final Fantasy Tactics can progress through a series of different job classes to learn new abilities, with more jobs being unlocked as certain other jobs level up, adhering to a job tree that reveals more powerful or advanced jobs as they become more proficient in earlier ones. Each character starts with just the basic squire or chemist roles available, which naturally represent physical training and magical knowledge. Gaining job levels as a squire will unlock jobs such as knight or archer, while the chemist will eventually be able to become a white or black mage. As you progress through the job tree, you'll find that later jobs will require you to level up several specific jobs to a certain point. For example, getting the powerful ninja job will necessitate that you level up archer, thief, and geomancer first. Each character moves up the job tree individually, and as job points are gained for each class, the player can use those job points to unlock permanent abilities that can then be assigned to that character whenever they want. Each character has access to 2 possible command abilities, such as black magic or a monk's martial arts skills, a reaction ability, such as counterattacks or parries, a passive ability, such as stat boosts or weapon preferences, and a movement ability, which affects how deftly the character can navigate the terrain. The first of 2 command abilities will always be fixed to whatever their current job is, but the other 4 options are always left up to the player to decide, allowing incredible amounts of customization and team-building strategies. So while the player's party size may only be half that of the parties in Tactics Ogre, the sheer potential for each party member to fulfill multiple roles more than makes up for this. And the game doesn't fail to take advantage of the battleground format of a TRPG. Characters take more damage when struck from the side or behind, while attacking a character from the front or their shielded side will make attacks more likely to miss. The attack range of archers increases exponentially if they fire from higher ground, and a character's movement range is halved if they're traveling through deep water. Spells can affect not only stats and damage output, but also movement capabilities and environmental effects, with float making characters immune to rough terrain, critical hits knocking characters back a tile or even off ledges, and the reflect spell actually ricocheting spells in a set direction relative to the angle it was fired from. Each combatant also has the bravery and faith stats, which determine how proficient a character is in physical and magical skills respectively. High bravery means a character is more likely to use their reaction abilities, as well as improves the strength of their barehanded or sword attacks. Meanwhile, faith affects a character's susceptibility to magic, both offensively and defensively. A character with high faith both deals and receives more damage from spells, and a character with 0 faith is unable to cast spells but also completely immune to them. Bravery and faith can be raised or lowered in numerous ways, but one should be careful not to change them too much. If a character's bravery becomes too low, they lose their nerve and go AWOL, while a character with max faith may become enlightened and forsake the battlefield in favor of devoting their life to the gods. As well as the elemental affinities typical to Final Fantasy, here we have the astrological zodiac signs playing a major role in the gameplay. Each party member, human or otherwise, has a zodiac sign that, along with gender, changes how effective or compatible each ally or enemy is with each other, adding another layer of gameplay depth for the player to take advantage of. but also not so prevalent as that the player feels obligated to adhere to its rules. Even the weather can change the efficacy of certain weapons or spell elements. For instance, when it's raining, fire becomes weaker and arrows are more likely to miss, but inversely, thunder spells become stronger. Similarly, ice spells are boosted in snowy conditions. It may not be quite as advanced as Tactics Ogre's systems, where, say, casting fire spells on a grass tile would turn it into a dirt tile, but there's still a lot of really cool in-depth mechanics to mess around with here. Most unique to Tactics, I think, is the new Calculator job, which deals damage or inflicts various effects to enemy targets based on mathematical equations related to things like the unit's current HP, level, or even elevation. Too bad they're so slow that they usually die before getting to do any of that. Over the course of the story, there are only around 50 mandatory battles to be fought, and progression is dictated by a world map of preset waypoints a la Super Mario Bros. 3. Random battles only occur at green dots on the map at a rate of around 30%, and each character involved in a fight gains EXP and JP for every action they take. In true TRPG fashion, you're likely to spend just as much time preparing your characters for battle as you are in the battles themselves. Like many of the Final Fantasy games that involve the job system, the real fun of the game comes in figuring out the most creative ways to break the game wide open. With just an hour or two of grinding fairly early into the game, you can unlock the majority of jobs before your 4th or 5th battle just by abusing the random encounters and drawing battles out as long as possible. But doing so only gets you so far, as even once you unlock a certain job, you probably won't have the proper equipment for them until later on, as shop inventories are only expanded once you pass key story points. In fact, leveling up too much early on, as in before you have the proper weapons and armor available, can be a detriment, as even though story battles typically have their enemies set to fixed levels and stats, random battles will scale their enemy's strength to the strongest character in your current roster. Coming up with clever job and ability combinations becomes the primary strategy throughout, and the system is so open-ended that you can pull off some very broken combinations. And that's even before you recruit Sid into your party, a 70-year-old man who could probably beat the entire game by himself. While battles themselves are limited to 5 characters, the player can actually have a total of 16 characters traveling with them. These can be unique story-related characters, a bunch of generics, or even tamed enemy monsters. Theoretically, every enemy you fight can be recruited to your side using the skills of the Mediator job, and probably the most useful application of this is in recruiting monsters to your side. Once among your posse, and as long as you have at least one of the 16 positions still open, monsters will continually lay eggs that can hatch into new, often stronger versions of that monster. Monsters can't branch out into new jobs like human party members can, but you can, however, decide to use the poach ability on your own bred monsters to potentially turn them into rare or powerful new equipment. You know, if the idea of turning your newborn monsters into gear isn't completely morally reprehensible to you. The combination of incredible customizability and the gradual progression of the job system infuses Final Fantasy Tactics with that addictive one more round mindset that defines a lot of tactical and strategy games. It's easy to get engrossed in the game's systems, losing hours of time as you keep telling yourself, well, just one more battle and I'll finally learn that useful new skill, and then, well, now I'm so close to unlocking a new job, I may as well get that done too. Followed with, well, my new monster just hatched, let's see if I can poach any cool items from it, and oh god, is that the sun rising outside my window? It's the type of game that rewards players for planning things out, but also doesn't punish them for learning as they go. The game is really only as difficult as you make it. And whether it was the intention or not, it was kind of a genius move to release a game like this right in the wake of Final Fantasy VII. If RPGs were a niche genre before FF7's massive success, then tactical RPGs were a niche within a niche. A game like Final Fantasy Tactics wouldn't have found the massive audience it did if FF7 hadn't opened the floodgates. FF7 had convinced millions of people to try an RPG for the first time in their life, and less than 6 months later, Final Fantasy Tactics was tricking a lot of those same people into trying a TRPG for the first time. It was a Trojan horse sneaking its way into a group of unsuspecting casual gamers simply by associating itself with one of the biggest games of the year. And when it comes to the story of these two games, Final Fantasy Tactics is basically the polar opposite of Final Fantasy VII. Both aesthetically and tonally, the two could not be more different. Final Fantasy VII is a grandiose, cinematic, futuristic cyberpunk dystopia, taking clear inspiration from popular anime and classic Hollywood, with a cast of characters with very clear-cut morals and motivations. Final Fantasy Tactics, meanwhile, is the product of Yasumi Matsuno, a man seemingly fascinated with stories of medieval political intrigue and religious corruption, inspired by real historical European conflicts such as the War of the Roses. Tactics is set in a world rife with much moral complexity, with every major character, knowingly or otherwise, constantly wrapped up in a convoluted web of manipulation and conspiracy. There's a tangible, poetic, Shakespearean flavor to every scene, as a heated war for the throne sees characters of all factions constantly trying to play 4D chess with one another and play one another for fools to achieve their own ends. And the setting of Final Fantasy Tactics, the land of Ivalice, is absolutely packed with backstory and lore that makes it easily the most tangible, believable setting in all of Final Fantasy. The game is full of lexicons and documents that outline the rich political and religious history of the world, making Ivalice truly feel like a real place with a long and storied past and layers upon layers of complexity, rather than just a random collection of generic cities and towns that plopped out of the ground out of nowhere. But Tactics also isn't lacking in character interactions. Beneath all the backstabbings, political intrigue, and class divides, the story of Final Fantasy Tactics at its core is a story of two friends gradually torn apart by a war that was completely out of their control. Main character Ramza, a member of the noble Beowulf family, and his best friend Delita, a commoner, both end up caught in the War of the Lions, a massive struggle for power between two royals who both believe they are rightful heir to the throne of a deceased king. The various political rulers of Ivalice have all taken one of the two sides, and the common folk are left only to sink lower and lower in the wake of it all. Upon learning that even his own brothers aren't above committing atrocities for the sake of power, Ramza distances himself from his royal name and challenges the Church of Glabados. Delita, meanwhile, after facing a betrayal that results in the death of his sister, uses his wits to attain high rank in the midst of all the political squalor, with the intention of bringing the entire hierarchy down from the inside. The story definitely pulls from the real-life history of many European nations and religions. I mean, just look up some of the stuff the Catholic Church did back in the day. They were up to some shady business. As Ramza continually threatens to expose the Church's lies, he is eventually branded a fugitive and a heretic, even as his actions end up saving Ivalice from a band of literal demons. Meanwhile, Delita commits a series of crimes and murders and constantly manipulates basically everyone around him, seemingly even the woman he claims to love, for the sake of creating chaos amongst the nobility, in the hopes that the established noble classes would tear themselves apart. But within Ivalice, Delita is remembered throughout history as a commoner who rose through the ranks to bring peace to a chaotic kingdom, whereas very little is said of Ramza other than that he was a heretic. And it's this sort of layered, morally gray political intrigue that's something of a signature for Yasumi Matsuno's games. Of course, that story can sometimes be hard to follow with the absolutely slapdash English localization the game received. All of the problems I outlined with FF7's English translation are just as prominent here, and I'd say in an even more damning state. Final Fantasy VII's story was beefy, but not particularly complex, meaning that even with the finer details a bit muddied by a sloppy translation, the average player can still largely understand the story on a point-by-point basis. Final Fantasy Tactics, though, is a comparatively much more layered story, with a lot of concurrent moving parts and finer details that are vital to understanding the larger story. It is, after all, a political drama with an almost obsessive amount of tertiary lore, and so even the most attentive of players may find themselves requiring a cheat sheet to keep track of all the plot's major players and storylines. And that's the type of story that really suffers when it isn't given a great translation, because every line of dialogue and every minute detail really matters here. I recall at least one critic at the time claiming that Final Fantasy Tactics' story was the most convoluted and indecipherable RPG plot they'd ever seen. And while it's true the story does commit a few small narrative faux pas, the first chapter includes a flashback within a flashback for instance, I'm convinced that the blame for this criticism mostly lies on the game's English script, bordering on caveman speak a lot of the time. Even the tutorial gets its spellings and terminology mixed up, getting the name of Phoenix Downs wrong for instance, and at one point the game spells the same word 2 different ways within the same sentence. Humorously to me, and perhaps nobody else, the various in-game lexicons somehow end up with 2 different spellings of Yggdrasil, and both of them are wrong. The game can't decide whether it wants to use the terms priest and wizard, or white mage and black mage, since it keeps switching back and forth. I could go on for probably an hour here. Final Fantasy Tactics English script truly feels like it has no proofreading done whatsoever. Not even the game's attract mode is free of obvious typos, which is especially baffling given that these attract modes were typically used as trailers prior to a game's release. This is the game trying to make a good first impression, and even then it seems like the QA team was asleep at the wheel, assuming the localizers even had a QA team in the first place. The reports your characters give when returning from propositions are both confounding and hilarious, delivered almost exclusively in incomplete sentences and gibberish. And speaking of those propositions, that's one of the several bits of side content the game features. About 30% of the game's overall content is optional, giving completionists something to chew on during the game's main storyline. Most prevalent of the side content are propositions, odd jobs your generic party members can take on to receive bonus job points, money, and sometimes additional lore discoveries. New propositions show up as you progress the main story, and a small handful are also only available during certain months on the in-game calendar. Propositions can take upwards of a week or two to complete, with each waypoint on the game's world map representing 1 day's worth of travel, during which time the assigned characters will be unable to participate in any battles. Whether your characters succeed or fail at the assigned task is determined by an invisible score that factors in each character's current job, EXP, and bravery, and should you fail at an errand, it'll be posted for availability again after about a month of in-game time passes. I like these propositions in theory. It's fun to discover new artifacts or locations and read up on their lore, which are often sprinkled with little references to past Final Fantasy titles. But in practice, it kinda sucks that I have to shove aside a bunch of my recruited party members to get the propositions done, and since most players typically won't want any of their posse to fall behind on EXP, what typically happens is players traveling between 2 safe waypoints on the map until enough days have passed to get their characters back. The monetary rewards are usually worth the trouble, but not always. Each proposition charges a fee in order to sign up, and while most are generous in their gil payout, some only offer marginal profits, while others actually end up costing more than they earn. Granted, these aren't super necessary for casual playthroughs. They're mostly just a means of gaining additional job points and gil through a method other than battling, and you can simply ignore them if you want. Propositions also require that you send generic foot soldiers, as story-related characters must stay in the party once they are recruited. However, even though you can recruit new soldiers to your team for a certain fee at any of the game's towns or castles, the game seems to almost discourage the player from keeping a bunch of generics around. While battles are limited to 5 characters at a time, your actual roster of available fighters can reach as high as 16, and by the end of the game, the total number of unique story-related fighters comes out to exactly 16. Well, okay, Lad, Alicia, and Lavion don't really count as unique characters, but you may as well keep them around, since if you plan to keep every story-related character, which is a smart idea given that they tend to have powerful skills that can't be learned by anyone else, then those 3 will be the only characters that can be sent on errands. Party members can be dismissed from your ranks at any time, although they'll definitely try to guilt-trip you into letting them stay, my god. And in true TRPG fashion, this game also features permadeath. While characters can be revived from KO with Phoenix Downs or Raise spells, if anyone remains downed for more than a few turns, they'll disappear and be gone forever. Not even story-related characters are immune to this, but since the story had to be written to account for the possibility of characters dying at any time, this does also mean that each character just sort of stops being relevant after their introductory arcs have settled. There's no real long-term penalty for dismissing characters or letting them die, with the exception of Mustadio and Beowulf unlocking additional side quests if you keep them around. But because of the 16 character limit on roster, this unfortunately means that if you want to keep every story-related character, you'll have no wiggle room when it comes to raising additional monsters or recruiting additional generic troops. I mean, I guess Marak and Rafa aren't all that great, and you don't really need Biblos or Boko, but if you dismiss or poach Boko, you are a heartless monster and we both know it. I really think the overall roster size should have been doubled to actually allow the player to further experiment with the game's various recruitment and character possibilities. There are also a few points in the story where you can end up soft-locking yourself in an unwinnable situation. This isn't terribly uncommon in TRPGs, and keeping multiple save files is a habit you should already have picked up if you're adept in the genre. But in a handful of instances, you're locked into a series of 3 or 4 battles in a row that must be won in order to proceed. The game allows you to save and organize your troops between each fight, but you cannot leave to restock supplies or grind additional levels if you find you're not strong enough. This can feel especially unfair when a lot of these battles are against characters with skills so powerful that the odds can feel disproportionately stacked against the player's favor. This isn't really something I'd call an outright flaw in terms of game design, but it's definitely something that people have fallen victim to and something to look out for. Keep multiple saves, guys. The small handful of story-related side quests are all fine, and most of them exist for the purpose of recruiting additional characters or fleshing out existing ones. There's one final endgame side quest that involves conquering 10 floors of a dungeon full of powerful enemies, that culminates in a confrontation with a sort of super boss. But the most notable side quest for most fans, especially at the time, was the one that allows you to recruit Cloud into the party, apparently lost in space-time during his fall into the lifestream in FF7. This is a neat little Easter egg and a savvy bit of franchise synergy, but in practice it almost seems like the inclusion of Cloud was done to troll people. His side quest can't be completed until you're already basically 95% of the way through the game, and unlike every other new recruit, which all join you at a level that reflects your roster's current EXP average, Cloud joins at level 1. His limit break abilities also require that you first locate and equip his unique materia blade from atop a volcano, with no explanation that you would need this weapon, nor any indication of where to find it. And his limit breaks aren't even all that great. They use his magic stat to determine damage output, even though Cloud's stats are built for physical damage. And the fact that they can only target tiles instead of units, paired with their typically slow charge times, means that they're completely impractical in most situations. Functionally, Cloud ends up being one of the worst party members in the game, but god damn it if the first question many people asked about this game back in the day wasn't, how do I recruit Cloud? And that just goes to show how massively important Final Fantasy VII's success was to the success of Final Fantasy Tactics, not to mention every Final Fantasy game released afterwards. As great as Tactics is as a standalone game, it's not a stretch to say that it wouldn't have found nearly as big an international audience if FF7 hadn't first paved the way. Much as its older brother introduced many people to role-playing games, FF Tactics introduced them to a more specific, more laser-focused subgenre of role-playing games. It was something a lot of people didn't see coming, a slower, relatively lower-budget strategy game busting through the mainstream and becoming a million seller. It encouraged many people to branch out and try a genre of game they would never have considered otherwise, and it did so in large part by hiding behind the guise of big-name brand recognition, making Final Fantasy Tactics quite possibly the most effective Trojan horse in gaming history.